What's the most political thing that's ever happened in Britain?
I'm not sure. I think. Gosh, that's a tricky question in the sense that there are definitely degrees of. Gosh, what's the most political? So there are lots of things that are straightforwardly political, and then there are other things that are not. They're sort of halfway, I guess. But I genuinely can't identify the most political.
Second most?
Usually politics is really boring, but this year it got more interesting because it had Russell Brand in it. It was good because when politicians talk, they use all this boring language normal people don't use, that you can't understand. But he cut through all that by talking in Victorian.
And the phrase that these women have come up with, social housing, not social cleansing, is incredibly germane, incredibly apposite.
Then he brought out a book called Revolution about how unfair everything is. And so you'd know he meant it. He pulled a serious face on the front. It was about how catapultism is naughty and how we could build a better world if we were nice to each other instead of spending all our time thinking about coins.
Energy companies are subsidised by our taxes while renewable energies are ignored. I know you can't support that system, Evan.
He'd talk about how the status quo keeps the working classes enslaved, which I found sort of boring compared to the stuff he used to do about putting his dinkle into granddaughters. What he's saying might actually be stupid, but it's hard to tell because he says it with clever words.
We don't want pedagogic figures coming in and didactically shouting at us.
So the only people who can actually tell if he's stupid are clever themselves, and they think everyone's stupid compared to them anyway. Basically, the only way to find out if he's clever or stupid will be to do everything he says and see if society totally collapses and hundreds of thousands of people die.
Thank you. I'm in a sort of PlayStation House of Commons, which you can see, and I can't because it's all green where I am. This election's important for politicians because if they lose, they get hung. And it's all about winning seats, which is weird because, as you can see, they're actually benches. The important bit's that white dotted finish line down there. Basically, when the votes come in, they sit in rows like a school photo until there's enough of them to go over that line. So if the Tories do brilliantly or breed and make loads of new blue flavour MPs, it might look like this. See, the benches are filling up with blue stuff like a tenner lady pad. In this case, they've got 335's worth, which means they flood over the line and they've won Britain. But what would happen if Labour did sort of OK, but not as good as that? See, that's not enough to get them over the winning line, and apparently they're not allowed to just shuffle along, sort of spacing their bums apart along the benches so they are over the line. Instead, they have to borrow MPs off other parties. So, say they nicked 25 Liberal Democrats. That's something, but not enough. So they might have to get some SNP people in like they've promised they definitely won't. And that does take them over the line, and the SNP and Lib Dem colours are so similar they'd probably get on. The Tories and UKIP don't want that to happen, but the ones who'd be most angry are the Greens, because the benches were green to start with before all the other colours came in, so they were winning by 100%, and now they've been left with fuck all. But that's democracy. Thanks to inflation, prices were getting bigger while wages were getting smaller. The country was in chaos. Britain was said to have the British disease, and there was no known cure, apart from not to be Britain anymore, which is why Ted Heath insisted we should become part of Europe. Soon Britain entered the European Common Market in what should have been called Brentrance, but wasn't. It was so perfect, we held a referendum to check whether Britain should stay in Europe.
Yes is now showing at 67% and the no vote at 33%.
And it turned out everybody was happy with the idea, as a majority secretly are today, but daren't mention.
But Britain isn't the only disunited country. Since Donald Trump became president in 2017 with no government experience, something which is still true today, the USA has also been at war with itself.
Fuck you!
Fuck you! Fuck you!
Trump keeps doing stuff like locking kids in cages and telling people to go back to where they came from, which they can't anyway because he's building a wall around the country to stop them from escaping.
Donald Trump should be a hero to a lot of people. He's really moved the goalposts on how incompetent you can be and still keep your job.
I hope they now go and take a look at the oranges of the investigation.
If he'd been in my office, he'd have had at least one verbal warning by now, and he might have been asked to go on a course. There was loads and loads of coverage of it.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi announcing a formal impeachment inquiry of President Trump.
The president responding on Twitter, calling it more breaking news witch hunt garbage and presidential harassment.
Anyway, now they're trying to impeach him, which I think is some sort of skin treatment to make him the right colour again. The last president who got impeached was Bill Clinton, who had to resign and was never seen or heard of again. But then Clinton's crimes were unforgivable, like doing hand and mouth stuff with a lady who wasn't his wife. I don't know what Trump's accused of, but I'd be amazed if he's ever done something as bad as that. Something had to be done. So it was decided to start the 1980s a year early with the election of a new Prime Minister in 1979. Margaret Thatcher, street name, Mrs.
Her Majesty, the Queen, has asked me to form a new administration.
Thatcher's election was a watershed. It proved that absolutely anyone could become Prime Minister, provided they went to Oxford and married a millionaire. As well as a uterus, Mrs. Thatcher had a vision, an economic vision with all coins up it. She believed in laissez-faire economics, which is French for something, and then English again for the economics bit. OK, let's pretend it's the 1980s, and I'm Margaret Thatcher. This is a political interview. What would you ask me?
I think I would start by asking if this was the early part of her period in office, why she was setting interest rates so high, why she was allowing the exchange rate to go so high in a way that was really damaging British industry and causing a huge rise in unemployment. And didn't she think that she was causing huge unnecessary suffering?
You're not expecting me to answer that, seriously.
But is it true you don't even vote?
Yeah, no, I don't vote.
It was good because I've always thought I should get more interested in politics, but now I know I don't have to.
You've never, ever voted?
No, do you think that's really bad?
I don't vote either. I might if it was someone proper like Bono or Sherlock Holmes or something. But the one time I went to vote, it's just all these names of local people like Colin whatever or Shabna something. And you've not heard of him, so how do you know who's good?
There's going to be a revolution. It's totally going to happen. I think not only I ain't got a flicker of doubt. This is the end.
People were like, oh, you shouldn't say that. Revolutions are bad because they get all sort of gunfiery and thousands die. But he meant revolution of the mind, which is better than a real revolution because nothing actually happens. Donald Trump was doing really well in his campaign, like he hadn't put a foot wrong. And then suddenly this video came out that put him in a totally new light. And he didn't seem as nice as you thought he was when he was just shouting about Muslims and Mexicans.
You can do anything.
Whatever you want.
Grab him by the pussy.
The bloke he'd said this stuff to was this sort of snickering gimp boy called Billy Bush, and everyone was so disgusted with him, he got fired.
The NBC TV network has sacked Billy Bush as host of the Today Show.
But there was literally nothing anyone could do to punish Donald Trump. They had literally no choice but to go ahead and vote for him.
After the tape appeared, all these women came out to say he'd done creepy things to them too. But there wasn't really any evidence that he'd actually do stuff like that, apart from the recording of him saying he did. And that was just his word against his. Scotland wasn't sure it wanted to be British anymore, and thought being Scottish might be good enough.
Delegates, it's game on for Scotland.
It's funny, why do Scottish people hate the English when the English have absolutely no feelings at all about the Scots?
I suppose it's a bit like a marriage of an old couple. It's as though Scotland and England got married when they were young, and it's constantly under debate whether they're better off staying together for the sake of the pension and the house, or if they should get divorced.
Do you think England snores?
England looks to me like the kind of person that snores.
At the start of 2019, there was this sort of Theresa May woman who'd been Prime Minister by mistake for almost 3 years. Some people thought Theresa May looked awkward in her own skin, but I'm not convinced it was her own skin. She had this sort of habit of going with her mouth like a fish that had just got hooked on a political problem. Even when she was smiling, you could see her face start thinking, I'm not sure about this, and then she'd start all over the shop.
Anyway, her biggest problem was she'd set herself the job of delivering some sort of Brexit deal, but no one could agree on what that was. In fact, the only thing anyone did agree on was that she was making the disagreements worse.
By April, the whole thing was in total shitlock. So we had to hold a European elections. That's when Nigel Farage invented the Brexit Party. It's one of those no-nonsense names that does what it says on the tin, like that pile cream called Anus Hole, although that comes in a tube, not a tin, I expect.
When the votes were counted, the Tories hadn't done great, so Theresa had to Article 50 the shit out of herself. She said she was going to quit and did a bye-bye speech where her voice went a bit wobbly at the end.
To have had the opportunity to serve the country I love.
I felt a bit sorry for her because it showed she really was capable of regular human emotions like self-pity and resentment.
Once Theresa May had gone, they had a race to be the new Prime Minister among all these young hopefuls like Michael Gove and the first baby to be Home Secretary and this sort of teeth bloke who looked like a cross between Eddie Redmayne and the child catcher. But the front runner was always Boris Johnson.
When you see him on the news with his hair and his face looking like an overstuffed scarecrow that's fallen in a trough of pink-flavoured Angel Delight, you think, hang on, I'm going to absolutely piss myself here, like a cartoon's just come on. But instead of telling jokes, he just sort of makes posh buffering noises.
I'm cautiously optimistic. How is that good enough?
Philip Schofield had gone on the internet and he'd found the names of these people. And because Philip Schofield's a good bloke, you know, he didn't just walk away, you know, turn a blind eye. He wrote the names down and he spends like, you know, a whole 3 minutes doing this, you know, really puts his back into it. And then later, David Cameron's on this morning being all like, oh, you know, I'm the Prime Minister, and doing his serious face and his hand gestures he learned in Prime Minister school. And Philip Schofield, right, goes like, bang, here's a list of pedos, fucking sort it out.
I have those names there. Those are the names on a piece of paper. You know the names on that piece of paper. Will you be speaking to those people?
But instead of thanking him, Cameron goes all pissy about it, going like, oh, that's dangerous.
I think, Philip, this is really important, right? Because there is a danger, if we're not careful, that this can turn into a sort of witch hunt.
There's no point in a witch hunt against pedos because pedos are harder to spot than witches. So a witch hunt isn't enough. We used to have like trials in a court when someone was a paedophile, right? But that cost loads of money and sometimes it didn't work because you'd find out they weren't one after all.
But now, because we've got computers, we can decide, you know, who's a pedo or who looks like a pedo and then work out, you know, what they've done and make up all the proper facts and everything and then find out where they live and tweet the coordinates and get together and go around and kill them with their bare hands right in their own homes. I mean, that hasn't actually happened yet, but it will. And it'll probably happen next year and it'll be brilliant. Trouble was brewing overseas at a faraway corner of foreign Britain known as the Isle of Falklands Island. This island was invaded by Argentinians who'd mistaken it for an identical island they'd left lying around in exactly the same place a few centuries ago. Mrs. Thatcher immediately fought back by bravely ordering troops to fight and die on her behalf. And soon, that famous flag, the Union Jack, was flying over the Isle of Falklands Island once again. Beating the Argentines at war sealed Mrs. Thatcher's reputation as a tough guy so much that people started to call her the Iron Lady. And she soon got another chance to prove how hard she was, not in a major war, but a minor strike. During Mrs. Thatcher's reign, there was the miners' strike, wasn't there? Yeah. Why was it considered minor?
It wasn't considered minor, it was a strike by miners, people who go, you know, underground and dig out coal.
Right. What's a mine?
So a mine is the underground construction where you dig out the coal.
Right. What's coal?
So coal is this black rock that you burn.
Right. And that's grown underground.
And that's underground.
So the miners go in the mine.
They do.
And they get the coal.
And they get the coal.
And then they went on strike.
Yeah.
People don't pay attention to politics anymore because it's not as interesting as like celebrity ski jumping or whatever. So it's hard for the parties to get publicity. But there was this Lib Dem party who was so good at publicity, they could turn anything into a huge news story and make sure the leader was all over the telly for days looking really commanding and in charge and that.
A challenge to Nick Clegg's authority as he faces a growing row over the Liberal Democrat peer accused of sexual harassment.
They had this Renard man who looked a bit like Harold Bishop off Neighbours, who stood around in photos dressed as Father Christmas, and he was accused of doing all these inappropriate things which he denied.
Everyone wanted him to say sorry, but he reckoned he didn't have to. So instead, he expressed regret, which isn't quite the same, and it caused this stupid stalemate. Like, if he didn't want to say a full sorry, he could have said soz, which is sort of half sorry. The Yellow Party used to be thought of as all hippie sort of do-gooder people who eat whole wheat cereal and care about Syria and things, which was boring, but now they're sort of more dangerous. Like now, when you see the logo, you immediately think about bad sex stuff, which is loads more interesting, so they really stick in your head. Nick Clegg must be really pleased about that. But Thatcher's luck couldn't last forever, and as the 1990s approached, she got too ambitious by unveiling the controversial poll tax, a tax on people called Paul, and they were furious. Following a wave of protests, Thatcher wound up on her iron arse, leaving Downing Street crying tears down her face, which she'd never done before in case it rusted. Anyway, it doesn't matter what happens in here. It's outside in Great England Kingdom where the politics actually happens. And apparently if I do this with my arms, I'm outside now. Has it happened? Has it happened yet? Has it happened? Has it? OK. Just nod next time. So I'm standing outside on Britain, but it's not real Britain, it's sort of jigsaw Britain. Oh, I can see it on the monitor. It's like being Godzilla or that illegal weatherman. Actually, I don't want to fall over the edge, I'll just take a few steps forward. Anyway, what happens next is some column tower things come up out of the ground, which is exactly what happened in the 2010 election. These columns aren't really there, although it looks like they are there because I've walked behind them. So this is basically like the Matrix. It's mental. And there's also this one, which is more sort of glassy and fragile and has numbers everywhere. And as you can see, there's literally no point trying to make any sense of it. It's that complicated. Anyway, that's all with the graphics. So it's back to you, Mr. Brooker, if you can hear me from wherever you are.
Thank you, Philomena.
There's a sort of middle ground of unpleasantness that works well. You have to say or do something dodgy, but not so dodgy, no one will defend it. Like a white bloke wearing blackface in the dark. You know, something that'll divide and confuse people just enough that they spend the time arguing with each other rather than with you. Apparently everyone's caught polarisation, which is this sort of brain disease where you're angry all the time. It spreads on the internet and there's no vaccine for it yet. And even if there was, I wouldn't take it because I don't believe in vaccines anymore because of Facebook.
What do we want? Brexit! When do we want? Now!
It's all because of Brexit, basically. It's torn people apart. My mate Paul's finding it extra hard because he's bipolar and his upside is remain, but his downside is leave. He's barely on speaking terms with himself most days, which is quite an improvement, actually. Don't get me wrong, all this constant modern hate is good fun, but it's knackering after a while. All my frowning muscles are worn out, my throat's raw from shouting. Some mornings I can barely shake a fist. I think what I need is a bit of a break, maybe tone it down for a weekend, spend it just slightly resenting things. I need to recharge my batteries because in 2020, I'm hoping to hate the fucking shit out of everything that moves. But one name sums up the 90s better than anyone else. Blur. In the 1997 election, why do you think more people voted for Tony Blair than Oasis?
You're making a mistake which was quite common at the time, that because the Prime Minister or Labour Party leader at the time was called Tony Blair.
Blur.
Blair.
Blur.
Blair.
Blur.
Blair.
Blur.
Tony Blair was
Blur.
Blur. Prime Minister and leader of the Labour Party, and there was one of the biggest rock or pop bands of the time was Blur.
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 Yeah. Early on, Corbyn and Johnson had to go on this sort of game show where Boris had to mention Brexit as often as possible and Jeremy had to pretend he hadn't heard him. Neither of them looked very statesmanlike. Corbyn had these off-putting glasses and Johnson was like a failed reboot of the Honey Monster making a court appearance. It was like a Mock the Week special where they kept getting laughs with their material, but by accident.
Does the truth matter in this election?
I think it does, and I think it's very important.
While the debate was on, the Tories changed their Twitter name to Fact Check UK, so they looked like an independent fact-checking service. They got shit for that, but to be fair, it only fooled everyone who saw it.
The Tories had this simple slogan they kept saying over and over again.
Get Brexit done, get Brexit done, get Brexit done.
Which meant you knew who to vote for if you wanted to get Brexit gone.
People said Jeremy Corbyn's Brexit position was hard to understand, just because it couldn't be summed up in a snappy soundbite or a short book. But it was really simple. He said he'd negotiate a new deal, then put that to the public in a referendum, which he'd be neutral about. Then he'd subtract the deal you first thought of, fold the result in half and multiply it by the Jews. What's the problem? There were lots of people talking about tactical voting. To vote tactically, you had to ignore who you wanted to vote for and instead vote Lib Dem. Through the 90s, Blair solved all the nation's problems. The economy, health, education, even the Irish troubles. There was nothing he couldn't do. But no sooner had the 21st century started happening than Blair dragged Britain into the war on terror. But the war in Iraq proved about as popular as infanticide-flavoured crisps, and Blair's legacy was well and truly shot through a bin bag. Blair slinked off to live inside a haunted mirror, leaving number 10 under the stewardship of a man with all the carefree joie de vivre of a haunted cave in Poland, Gordon Brown. Gordon Brown knew mainly about coins, but that wouldn't help him because all the coins were about to implode. In a financial crisis, which would become known as the financial crisis. People say the financial crisis happened because it just got too complicated, and it's all because of the maths. If we took maths out of the equation, it'd be much easier. Couldn't we use something else instead of numbers?
I think that actually you're right in a way, that there is too much maths in the way that people think about the economy. And one of the things that occasionally goes wrong is that economists think that they can build...
Let's go, girls.
Sorry about that. Ed Miliband's dad, right, hated Britain, but no one knew because most of the things he did suggested he didn't. But then the Daily Mail found out he did hate Britain, so they did this big dramatic news story about it with all massive headlines and everything. And then Ed Miliband got all upset and went on the news to say they were out of order.
That is a lie, and I'm not willing to let it stand.
Most people love or hate different bits of Britain, like I hate the M6, but Ralph Miliband hated all of Britain. He hated London, he hated Manchester, he hated Leeds, he hated Glasgow, he hated South Wales, he hated North Wales, he hated the Lake District and the Peak District and all the shires. If it was in Britain and it was a place, he hated it.
But he also hated things in Britain as well. So he hated British people, he hated British wildlife, he hated all the coins and the stamps and the phone boxes, and like even down to stuff like shoelaces and things like that aren't even worth hating. He hated them anyway.
He hated Paddington Bear and Made in Chelsea and Tom Daly and Dawn French.
He hated QI and all those British shops like Zara and Aldi and KFC and Delice de France. He hated the British Museum and British Gas and British Airways and British Sea Power, British Rail. Even after they changed the name to Railtrack, he never forgave them.
He hated Leon Britton, Fern Britton, Brittany Ferries and Britney Spears.
He even hated British air. That's why he stopped breathing it.
And he hated British children, so when Ed Miliband was on TV defending him, he'd have hated it because Ed Miliband's British and Ralph Miliband hated Britain. And all the Mail did was point that out. After Gordon Brown stuck a plaster on the economy and left, the country needed a strong leader, and luckily, one man stepped up to single-handedly save the nation. The finest Prime Minister Britain has ever had, a man whose name will never be forgotten, Davis Cameron. Davis Cameron skillfully almost won the 2010 election and formed a Brokeback Mountain-style coalition with the equally visionary and beloved Nick Clegg. Almost immediately, Britain's problems, apart from the economy and social injustice and all the other ones, were solved. And by 2011, everything was going swimmingly. Then the chief rabbi said the Labour Party had a serious problem with anti-Semitism, and the next day Corbyn was interviewed by Andrew Neil, and he didn't say sorry once, or twice, or all. Boris Johnson was supposed to be interviewed too, but when he saw what Andrew Neil had done to Corbyn, he must have shut his own arse up his back, because suddenly he was too busy doing other things. And he was brave enough to appear on This Morning, which is a notoriously hostile environment for Amanda Holden. One morning, a reporter tracked Boris down and asked him to look at this shocking photo of a boy sleeping on a hospital floor.
But when confronted with this image by an ITV reporter today, the Prime Minister at first refused to even look at it.
It's not fair to expect Boris to focus on an interview with a suffering child directly in his field of vision. He might be overcome with emotion and just start laughing. So he did the decent thing and nicked the reporter's phone. Anyway, in the last few days, the polls tightened and Labour and the Tories were neck and neck, apart from the huge gap between them.
Boris Johnson leads the Conservatives to a resounding election victory.
I urge everyone to find closure and to let the healing begin.
It's a lot of power for someone like him, but I'm sure it'll be fine. He'll probably look after us like we were his own children.